Hi, this is Coralla at CorallaFicklin.com and WelcomeNetwork.com. And I told you in a prior video that I was going to begin to do videos on the history of the English language. And frankly, I've been trying to figure out a way how to do that without boring you to death. How to make the history of the English language something interesting and relevant. Now, of course it's relevant. I mean, if you're going to study a language, if you want to know how to speak that language well, it only makes sense that you understand some of the history of that language, to understand some of the origins of that language. That's not in question. I don't think anybody would question that, correct? But I think what's in question is, but do I have to sit there and be bored to death? So I've been trying to figure out how to do it. Now, I'm going to do videos dealing straight with the history of the language. You know, starting with the England when it was Britain. England, because at that time it wasn't England. It was Britain before it had been invaded by the Romans, during the time that it was invaded, but during the time that it had been settled by the Romans, what language was spoken. And by the way, at that time, because England's very interesting, because at that time England was the language which was spoken in what is now England, which was called Britain at that time. It wasn't a Germanic language. It wasn't a Latin-based language, even though the Romans were there. It was a Celtic language. And if you come into WelcomeNetwork.com, you'll see the language tree and you'll see the Celtic languages. Okay, and like I said, I'm going to talk about this more in detail when I do a straight video, I'll try to make it interesting, but a straight video on the history of the English language. But English it was a Celtic language. Then, of course, after the conquest, after the fall of the Roman Empire and the invasions by the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, the Frisian, and all different other kind of Germanic tribes, the Celtic language was completely eliminated from England, and the language of what we now call England began to be and continues to be a more Germanic. But I said, well, how can I make it interesting? So I figured, especially for those people who aren't very interested in doing straight history, it'd be interesting to look at the development of the English language by looking at some of its most common words. For example, if you look at the verbs in English, okay, there are basically three sets. There are those verbs that came into English prior to 900. That is prior to being English going from Old English to Middle English. And Middle English it's no longer exclusively a Germanic-based language. Now you begin to see bits and pieces of Latin, because prior to 900, English is basically it's almost purely a Germanic language. It had bits and pieces of Latin, but the Latin that was there as a result of missionaries going to England trying to convert the people to Christianity, and maybe some foods, but basically no. Then you have the verbs that came into English, let's say, I think before 1000. Let me see. You have first the list. I'm going to look at the computer. I'm going to look at what you can look at when you come in, so I can get the dates correct. Okay, the dates correct. those verbs which entered English prior to 900. Now, these are all practically, all these verbs are irregular verbs. So I'm looking at the irregular verbs that entered into English prior to 900, right? Quite a few, huh? Then those verbs which entered into English prior to 1150, exactly. Now, from 1066, the conquest of the Norman conquest by the Duke of Normandy, okay, or by William the Duke of Normandy. But I've also seen it called William the Bastard, because he was a bastard. Bastard not in the sense, not in the vulgar sense that's used today when you call someone a bastard, but he was the illegitimate son of, okay. That means he was the illegitimate son, and illegitimate is not even used. His mother had not been married to his father. How about that? Okay. And then you see bits and pieces of French coming in. And the conquest was in 1066. So I'm looking at those words that came in between 900. Still, the Norman conquest had not taken place until 1150, about almost 100 years after the Norman conquest. I'm still talking about irregular verbs. In fact, all the verbs I'm talking about are irregular. Then, let me keep going down. Those verbs which entered into English after 1175. And these are considered, and believe it or not, relatively new verbs into English. So I thought that would be interesting, looking at the verbs that first entered English, then looking at those verbs which entered English later, okay, during the middle period, and then those verbs that entered English afterwards. But I said, but just verbs? Well, that would be interesting, but I wouldn't find that totally, have me, sitting on the edge of my seat. Then I thought, why not look at the body? The body, the head, the eyes, the words for the body. And those words which entered into English first versus those words that enter into English later. And through that, you can see a lot about how English evolved. A purely Germanic language. Some of the words entered with English was basically a Germanic language, and some of the words entered a little bit later. So that's what I thought I would do. And this way you can start through a back door looking at the history of the English language. Now, what I did was, especially when it came to looking at the body, where did the word eyes and nose and teeth and tongue and lips, neck, where did those words, what are the origins of those words? And can you see cognates of those words in other languages? And the answer is yes. But here's the problem. I can pronounce much better. Now, isn't this ironic? I can pronounce much better the words which are not cognates, but which are Latin based. I can pronounce those words much better, and probably to the point where they're intelligible to the people who speak those languages, than I can pronounce the actual cognates. Because most of the cognates of words of the body in English are from the Germanic side of English and not from the Latin side. But yet most English speakers are much more familiar with the Latin side of English, but the Latin side in the sense that if you study another language, you study the Latin base. You study Latin languages, Latin-based languages rather than Germanic languages. Not that many Americans who study, let's say, Norwegian or Dutch or German. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. So this is going to be called the Introduction to English 1. Corella Ficklin at CorellaFicklin.com.